Hello, thank you for joining me. I hope you're having a wonderful day, evening, night, wherever you're at. I wanted to talk a little bit about what alchemy is as far as it relates to metallurgy. There's many different kinds of alchemy, and the most common, if you hear somebody that says, I do alchemy, they're 99+% of the time they're talking about spiritual application, like Jung's perspective, applying alchemy to your mental health and spiritual health, and that's great. That's a huge part of it, and that's the beginning step of learning and understanding, is because you have to first start to become reborn in yourself. But my page, subjects I speak on, my interests are in the metallurgical side of things, and that subject is extremely difficult to find any actual real information on that's not written in the language of the birds. And if you don't know the language of the birds, then that could be a problem. And considering it's not a known language anymore today, as far as common knowledge goes, that's an even bigger problem. You run into 500 different people that each have 500 different opinions as to what this means, and in regards to the symbols, the steps in the process, the layout of the process itself is the same, because that's one of the few things that are really obvious and used to, the mortification and the fermentation, fixation, solidification, and each step in spiritual alchemy is a step in the growth of your spirit and mind and body, and we all go through those cycles of dying to our previous understandings and self and nature, and then going through a period of transformation, and then becoming fixed in that new place, and then we have to die again to become reborn and move forward again from that too. But it's forever, when you never arrive. And life is the journey, and so we just take it day by day. What I wanted to focus more on this time was to give you an idea of what how do you approach an understanding of the work when it comes to physical application. If I want to do alchemy on lead, where do I start, right? And how do I begin to understand what is happening? And the first step to that, in my opinion, is looking at the cultures, the times, like long ago, like even before pre-recorded history is now, but we don't have to go back that far for human beings to have a entirely different perspective on everything. But we, as humans, go through cycles as a group. We go through cycles in the same way, and we gain knowledge, and then disasters happen, and we lose knowledge, and then we keep going back and forth between advanced and primitive in our lifestyles. It doesn't mean that our brains are any less, than they are, but in my opinion. So in the ancient cultures, they all had the secret knowledge. Each group manifested it, and it manifested itself in a different way in each group of people. If you were in Greece and were a part of the temple of Athena, then you would have been introduced to the ancient knowledge. And if you were in Ireland and were, you know, with the ancient peoples that were there, which originally I believe came from Egypt, the Picts, then if you were a high priest, a Merlin among them, you would have had the knowledge. Every culture had it in their secret temples. If you were in Egypt, if you were a pharaoh or a high priest, you would have the knowledge. And then the small circle surrounding those people that helped with the work. But in these cultures, knowledge was an understanding of nature. The way that you would, like, if you go to a museum and you see displays of art by particular artists, whether it be carvings or paintings or anything, sculptures, you know, artwork. You come and you look at this art, not just to appreciate it, but also to gain a better understanding of the artist. And so by looking at nature and learning to understand the rhythms and the patterns and the cycles of nature as they happen in the earth will teach you and show you a picture, a glimpse of the character of the all, the source of everything that there is. And so they regarded an understanding of nature as an extremely sacred thing, because you weren't just understanding a physical matter, you were understanding the nature of the source of all matter. And so it was the priests, the high priests, that had this knowledge, and it was so sacred that if you spoke about it, you would be killed immediately. If you listened to someone speak about it, you would be killed immediately. It was not a small thing. And so what they were doing is they were looking at nature, the patterns and cycles of nature. And our society doesn't believe that these previous societies had a real understanding, and I believe that that's a misconception based on a lack of information that they understand. I think that some of these previous peoples that existed that we are unaware of were far beyond advanced from where we are in their understanding of how things worked. And like modern science is really good at taking things apart, but it still hasn't come to an understanding of how nature puts things together. Like, they're still trying to figure out how to even look at an atom. The newest, yeah, I could ramble about that. Rabbit trail. Okay, so when you're looking at nature and you see the most obvious of the patterns is the cycles of the seasons. You have winter, everything goes cold. The tree of life in alchemy is the white oak tree. And in the white oak, when it loses its leaves, it just looks completely dead because the bark is white. There's not any evidence of life in the tree at all, except for the woodpeckers coming and going out of the holes. Here in America, we have the pleated woodpeckers and the acorn woodpecker, and they like the white oak trees. And so you see the apparent death and then rebirth in the spring. The tree, all of a sudden, there's new growth in like a couple of weeks' time. Bam! Everything turns green, and it gets acorns and goes through the whole cycles, and then all the colors come in. You get the green and the yellow and the orange and the red as the seasons move forward, right? And so that's the most obvious. But when you start looking further and further and further, and imagine a culture that had an extremely long amount of time to gain knowledge. We, as a culture, in America, have had a few hundred years at best. Like, really, most of what we've learned has been the past 150 years, and in our advancement in technology. And so if you look at where we've come as a culture from 150 years ago till now, think about how exponential the growth of knowledge is. 150 years ago, everybody had horse and carts. There was it was a completely different world than it is today. And 100 years is a very short period of time in the scheme of things, of time on Earth. And so imagine if there was a culture that was able to exist uninterrupted for 10,000 years. If we've gained in 150 years this much knowledge, what could they have done with compound knowledge? The way knowledge expands, it's exponential. It doesn't just like slowly grow. Like, even in my lifetime, when I was a kid, there were no computers and no cell phones, and now everybody's got computers and cell phones. And so a culture that I was able to exist for, let's just throw random 10,000 years out there, and think about how that knowledge could have been expanded upon. And their focus was an understanding of nature and how nature operates. And so they observed, and they had a long time to observe and keep track and mark things. And just like we understand tectonic action, they understood tectonic action. And what happens, and a metallurgical alchemist is working on the mineral world. And so if he's going to be doing that, he is attempting to mimic what nature does in the mineral world. And so if you want to do that, if you want to find where that's going on in nature, you have to go to a volcano. Or you have to dive deep 30 to 40 miles down to the subjunction zones where the plates are binding into each other, and one's coming up and one's going down. And that's where that creates these fissures. And those fissures come up 30 or 40 miles and are filled with all different kinds of molten and hot boiling fluids coming up out of the earth. And if you look at how tectonic action works, you have a plate, like a big solid chunk of rock the size of the Pacific Ocean is one piece. And that piece is the ocean floor, and the ocean is sitting on top of that rock. And so there's a lot of weight there. It's not just the weight of the plate itself, it's the weight of the ocean on top of that. But the ocean is creating a deposit of salt. And if you've ever looked in the deserts where it used to be an ocean, and now there's these layers of salt, it's not just like a little bit of salt. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of feet thick layers of salt deposits that come from the ocean. And so the plate that's under the ocean is diving down underneath the plate that is the United States. And that happens like between 30 and 40 miles deep. Those two plates are rubbing into each other, and it creates friction, and it's constant, and so it starts to build up heat, and that's where the magma comes from. That's where you get your granites come up out and everything. The lava is born down in these subjunction zones, and then it creates these huge chambers of magma, and they eventually make little holes in their ceiling and pop volcanoes out of themselves. But what's happening is, you have to imagine that the ocean floor, this layer of salt, and it's not just salt. It has the same, the gases in salt water have the same amount of nitrogen as the air gases in the air. And so you have a tremendous amount of nitrogen, you have a tremendous amount of salt, and you have a tremendous amount of metals that are dissolved in the salt. You have chlorides of every kind, every possible metal in the salt already. And so this conveyor belt, this huge giant plate of salt and minerals and nitrates, is slowly being fed like a conveyor belt underneath into this pool of magma. And when the salts they start coming into the hot zone. Like before they even get into the magma zone, a lot of the salts are soluble long before they get to the magma zone, like potassiums and magnesiums, all these other salts, the sulfate salts, they're all quite soluble in low heat. And so there's a zone above the magma zone where these salts become fluid. And the other thing is these salts are coming in of every kind, and then they're meeting a chamber where sulfur is being introduced into it, and water, because now you're underground. I don't know if you've ever dug a hole very deep, but once you get any depth at all, you hit water. And so these chambers have water coming into them, they have salts coming into them, they have nitrates coming into them, they have chlorides of every metal coming into them, sulfate salts, and they have sulfurs. And they're all together in these mid to low temperature zones that have, like, the temperature between in that area ranges between body temperature and the melting point of lead, and just a little bit above that. And so it's not all the way down in the magma chamber, but it's like part way up the vein. If you were digging into a quartz vein in the mountains, those quartz veins go all the way down. They go 30-40 miles down into the subjunction zones, and because they're a crack between the plates that goes all the way down. So in this intersection where the water meets the sulfur and the salt and the nitrogen and the metals come together, you end up with these chambers. And some of the chambers, some of them are higher up and at lower temperatures, and some of them are lower down, higher temperatures. Some of them are able to vent and burp, and other ones remain under pressure. And that zone in the earth, that it's the ring of fire all the way around the Pacific plate, is that zone basically. And so that's where elements are born. They're also born in the magma, but that's a different reaction. That's called a dry reaction, because when it's down that far and that hot, the water is boiled away long before it gets that far. And so the free water doesn't reach down there because it's too hot. You're talking about the melting point of gold at the lower levels. And so the chambers that have water in them will remain at the level where because as soon as the water gets too far down, it just becomes vapor, and it pushes itself up again. And so the fluid chambers with the sulfur and the water and the salts all coming together are going to be at a higher point in the subjunction zone. And modern science refers to those zones as high pressure, low temperature zones. In that chamber is happening these cycles, the death and the rebirth and the fermentation and the fixation. And what you have is some of the chambers will be filled with one kind of solution, and the other chamber will be filled with another kind of solution, depending on how close they are to the hotter. And because some elements are more volatile, and so the hotter it becomes, the less of those more volatile elements you have in the solution. And so higher up solutions will have more nitrates, where further down solutions will have more sulfurs, and you end up with these chambers of different solutions. And then sometimes the wall of one chamber will break, and that solution will pour into the chamber of the other solution. And then when they come together, this one might be a base, an alkaloid, a high pH. And the other solution might be sulfur, and it'll be a really low pH. And so when those two solutions come together, then you have a reaction. And so all of a sudden, the cycle of nature begins. And elements that were at one point dead, seeds essentially of those elements, are now being reborn again and coming to life, and either growing and maturing into new metals, or they are multiplying and creating more of themselves. And it's learning to observe nature. If they say that over, of all the things that they say, watch and observe nature and how she works, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to mimic. You are a mimic. An alchemist doesn't have any special powers other than the ability to mimic. And that's why oftentimes in the hieroglyphs, the alchemist will be portrayed as a monkey. Because if you start to think of yourself too big, you're missing the point. You're mimicking the handiwork of a much greater artist. If you can mimic that handiwork, it does not make you the great artist. It makes you able to mimic the great artist. There's a difference. So, in metallurgical alchemy, you're learning the physical processes of nature. And it's in these processes, as you come further away from the heat of the belly of the earth, those same processes, the rules of those processes are the same, and the pattern of those processes are the same for the plants and the organics and the animals. And nature has like a set of universal laws that modern science hasn't like put that puzzle piece to connect those two things yet. And it's actually across the board applies to all physical matter, whether it be animal, vegetable, or mineral. So when biologist talks about mitosis of a cell, you have a single cell, like a chicken egg, right, is one cell. And then the chicken egg gets a catalyst, a sperm, is added to that single cell. And as soon as the catalyst comes in, that single cell divides. But as it divides, it creates two identical single cells, just like the big one, but they're smaller. And so as it divides, it's multiplying, right? And it will continue to divide and multiply until a few months later you have a chicken. It only takes like 3 months. And you have one single cell turned into billions of cells in the shape of a chicken. And we have no problem accepting that as truth because we see it happening. That's what happens. We can get a little microscope and we can watch the egg divide. We can see it multiply, and boom, now you have an embryo, right? That same law applies to the mineral world. Elements multiply and reproduce just like everything else. That's And because we can't get a microscope and stick it down in the belly of the earth and watch that happen, we don't understand it. We have, and so a metal, as we know it, gold or silver, or copper, everybody's seen iron, right? Those metals are dead. As in what I mean by dead is, if you had a crop of wheat and you harvested your crop and you collected the grain is dead. It was alive, and now it's been dried out into a dry grain. It's dead. If you added water to it, you could make it come to life and start to germinate and create another plant, which could produce 100 or 1,000 times its own amount of seed. Like, it was one seed, it could produce 1,000 seeds from that one, or more, depending on what kind of plant you're talking about. Tens of thousands of seeds from one seed. And so, but the seed itself, it's alive, and if you tried to take it while it was alive and hydrate it, it would rot and die. But once the seed has died and dried out, then you can hydrate it and bring it back to life and plant it again and get 100 times back of that seed or more. And the metals are the same way. The metals that we know are dead seed. And think of an individual atom of gold is a single seed, or an individual atom of iron is a single seed of iron. And it's a seed that has dried out and died. It doesn't have that living activity in it at that moment, but it contains within itself everything necessary for that activity to happen if the proper catalyst is added to it. And then, once the catalyst is added, the same thing that happens with the chicken egg happens with the metal. It starts to divide while it multiplies. But as it does, it becomes exponentially smaller in stages. And if you keep doing that long enough, you will have taken a molecule built in a particular design, because molecules are rather easy to manipulate. You can build a molecule fairly well if you have any understanding of how the things interact. You build a molecule the way you want it to be, and then you multiply and divide it until it becomes an atom. And that cycle of multiplication and division, exponentially dividing and multiplying it until you take a thing that was like a solid particle when you started and turn it into billions of the same exact design particle, except atom-sized. And so then, if the cycle continues to repeat itself, you end up with new atoms built on top of other atoms in layers. And so the element begins to grow. The lead goes from being lead to being silver to being, indium to being, platinum. And you can keep on adding new structures, but you have to start with something as your building block. So you take the building block, and what happens in the earth, the salt of the ocean contains nanoparticles of mineral. The nanoparticles of mineral ride the conveyor belt of the tectonic plate down into the subjunction zones. Those salts get added into the chemistry that's already happening in the volcano. And with the volcanoes right there in front of us, I'm always like, modern science completely, absolutely, and categorically denies the ability to use a chemical solution reaction process to cause decay and neutron capture in an element. But all these elements, we see them pouring out of the volcano. I mean, literally every possible element on Earth comes pouring out of the belly of the Earth in these magma pools. How can you deny that that's not a chemical reaction happening down inside there? You're talking about wet and dry chemical reactions. One's happening at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and one's happening at 600 degrees Fahrenheit, you know, and it's happening in front of our eyes. And the ocean takes these elements that have already been built, feeds them back into that process again, and then they get used as building blocks to build new elements over again. And nature, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Mandelbrot set. The Mandelbrot set is essentially what pixels are. And it's, you see a shape, and if you look at it closely, you see that shape again. And if you look at it closer, you see that shape again. And you could look at it closer and closer and closer and closer for almost infinity, and it will repeat itself over and over and over again. And that's how computers finally were able to make lifelike pictures and landscapes, because the Mandelbrot set became understood. And so then we understood how nature is just a constant repetition of the same design over and over and over again inside of itself, and infinitely smaller as it goes in. And that is the atom. The atom is the same design as the molecule, it's just infinitely smaller. And so the ancient scientists were able to look at the Earth, look at the volcano, look at the ocean, look at the elements, see what comes out of the belly of the Earth when it burps, and understand that, okay, elements are being born, and then they're being born again, and then they're being born again, and then they're being born again. And when they keep being born again, eventually they become, you know, all these fantastical elements that we use for making electricity and stuff. Dangerous ones, if they go through the cycle enough times. The science of nature, learning to observe what's happening on around us. This society has lost touch on a major part of society today, worldwide, has lost touch with nature itself, with the earth, and like, even to go outside and get dirt on you is like, oh my God, I've been exposed to the ground. And so the idea of them going out and observing nature is kind of like ridiculous almost. But that's not everybody, but society in general right now seems to be separating itself from nature as if it's not a part of nature. Well, if you look at the composition of your body and you look at the composition of a butter bean, it's the same. So you are nature. You're just as much a part of nature as every tree and every plant. And the difference is, we're given a responsibility to take care of that nature that surrounds us. And if you cut yourself off from it, if you live in a world where you're never exposed to nature or the elements of any kind, or don't even ever touch your feet to the ground, then how can you understand who you are, what you are? We are a part of this. earth, and when we die, we turn back into earth again. So to deny that we are just as, we're an expression of nature in the same way that a tree is an expression of nature, and a rock is an expression of nature. All these things are an expression of the artist. And so the search, the path to understanding nature also leads you to understanding yourself, and it leads you to understanding the source from which all things came to be. And that's the dividing point between the alchemist and the scientist today. Is modern science is generally bent towards the profit. They do work on projects that can make lots of money because money is the goal ultimately. Alchemy is not about making a profit. Alchemy is about learning to understand the universe, the physical world, all of matter, animal, vegetable, and mineral matter. How is it born? How is physical substance come out of what we have available? And once you begin to understand these processes that happen all around us every day in the earth and in everything that's alive around us goes through this process constantly. And so we see it, and then like Mother Goose tells you the process. And all these stories is all our heroes, Hercules, and like I could just go on forever naming all the different, but all the heroes of old, all the ancient gods, they all tell the same story, whether you go to India or you go to Norway or you go to Ireland or it doesn't matter. They have the knowledge and understanding of nature is a universal knowledge, and that's why the language that they used to pass this knowledge on was the language without words. It was the language that it didn't matter what verbal language you spoke. If you had an understanding of nature and you look at these pictures, you'll understand what they're talking about regardless of where you come from. And so the languages of the birds, they say, was potentially one of the original languages of the world, because it was understood by anybody that had been introduced to the science. So if your goal is to understand alchemy, a huge part of it is going to be the alchemy of yourself, your inner being. You're going to have to go through that before your eyes will be opened to understand the alchemy of the things around you. Because when you start working with the things around you, now you're talking about manipulating the substance from which all of creation was born. And it's a big responsibility. And you need to have an understanding of what you're doing before you're doing. Like Fulcanelli said, he says you don't take a journey without first knowing where you're going to go. And so the journey of alchemy of yourself shows you the direction, the path to alchemy beyond yourself. And a study of nature, the laws of nature, and they're happening all around you all the time, will show you. And if you're looking to understand the mineral world, then you have to look where the mineral world is born. Look into what is happening in a volcano. And volcanoes make fantastic crystals. I don't know if you've ever been a rock hound or not, but I love digging crystals out of the hills, and the best ones are the closer you get to the volcano, the better the crystals are. And how does that happen? Well, the rules of nature are universal across everything that has physical form. All things with physical form, whether they be animal, vegetable, or mineral, abide by the laws of nature, and the laws of nature are universal. And so you have to look at what is happening and what is the result, and what things are present during what is happening. And that will lead you in the right direction, because go visit a volcano, smell the air. There's a clue for you. And move on forward. Try to be like Old Faithful. Why does Old Faithful puff every 15 minutes? Why isn't it just a squirting fountain of water coming out? Think about that. What's happening down inside that chamber under the ground that you're standing on when you look at it to make it do that? Nature, in understanding it, leads to understanding yourself, leads to understanding other people, leads to understanding of the all, and how fantastical and amazing it is that matter can be born, considering how difficult of a process it is and how long it takes to be accomplished, and that it can't be disrupted in any way, the process. And if it is, it doesn't work. And so the fact that nature is able to pull this off repeatedly for billions of years and create all these different atoms and molecules and plants and animals and everything else, it's so incredible to fathom that all of this, everything, stems really from one thing. And that one thing becomes divided into 5 things. And then the balance of those 5 things put together makes everything that there is. It's unbelievable. It's fantastical. I hope you're having a good time in your adventure, in your journey, wherever it may take you. Everybody has their own personal legend to fulfill. And enjoy the path that you're on. And also, if you don't like the path that you're on, keep moving forward. Be blessed.